Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know it is very difficult to come here because it's a tough way and tough road from the first floor to the ground floor, especially at this time of the day. There is high traffic. Obviously, there are many things to discuss at the first floor, on the first floor. However, I believe that we have a lot to discuss here, more than 15 minutes, I suppose, but we only have 15 minutes. So I am going to try to make the best of them. Horia, my colleague from the New Strategy Center, has researched the topic of Ukrainian reconstruction. And we have here a study that I invite you all to read and to further on think about, and obviously ask questions to the author on the main drivers that we should have in mind for the Ukrainian reconstruction. Now, I'm going to start with the obvious question. Why now? Why are we focused now on rebuilding Ukraine while the war is still going on in Ukraine and while we are basically looking ahead to close the war? And what are the main drivers that you've looked at when you've done this research? So what was your focus?
Well, is it working? Yeah. First of all, please indulge me. I think after this panel, my own voice will need the reconstruction itself. I think that we have to start thinking about the beginning of the war. We all said it was a failure of intelligence on the part of the Russians, how they conceived the war. It's true, but we have to make sure not to replicate that model in having a failure of imagination. When we think about reconstruction, and we have a reconstruction orthodoxy in development studies, we reflexively think nowadays about Iraq, Afghanistan, the Marshall Plan. It comes like an instinct to mind immediately. But I think yes, history teaches us lessons, but as Edmund Burke said, history is the preceptor of prudence, not of principles. History does not give us a blueprint. We shall not be able to replicate the models that we used in post-conflict zones where we had to deal with different actors, different outcomes, and with a very certain timeline. And I think at this moment it is very important to understand that we do not have to give in to Russia to set in the tempo and to have a veto over reconstruction. We don't have to allow Russia to say the war is over and then we say, yes, we start reconstruction now. I think reconstruction can start in parallel with the war, of course in a differentiated manner. You will treat differently oblasts that are closer to the front line and oblasts that are further away from the front lines. For example, yes, you cannot rebuild immediately Kramatorsk or Kherson, but you can start doing some things in Kyiv, Odessa, and Mykolaiv right now. And I do not mean simply helping Ukraine to stay afloat during this war. I really mean giving aid to Ukraine to develop during this war so that at the end of the war, Ukraine is not only at the status quo ante, at the state before the war, but it would have witnessed a structural metamorphosis and it would have transformed its economy. And I think that the right moment is now and we have to prioritize. And I think we have to take a couple of factors into consideration when we decide how to invest, how to do it. First, distance from the front lines, then accessibility of international partners, regional or from over the seas. the overall significance in the Ukraine economy of that part that we are trying to reconstruct, and of course the availability of air defense, because rebuilding in a war zone means that you have to get protection there. And yeah.
Okay, well, talking about protection, we are on the front line here. So in Eastern Europe, we basically have the line protecting Europe and the transatlantic alliance now from Russian influence, and the line that is effectively supporting help for Ukraine. So what are the opportunities for us in this situation where we are also building up ourselves to build our defense capabilities as we go? And while we do need to help Ukraine, as you've said, get itself built up to basically be able to develop after the war and after the kinetic war stops in Ukraine. So what's the opportunity for the region?
Well, I think regional execution is very important in this case. I have 3 principles in this study: Ukrainian needs, global sponsorship, and regional execution. I think that the proximal actors to Ukraine, such as Romania, Poland, Slovakia, just to mention the countries that have direct access to Ukraine and can help directly, I think they can serve a very important role. First of all, as forward logistical basis, you can preposition construction hardware there and have it under a NATO umbrella, and then just move it across the border to Ukraine and do the work. And you can use themselves. They have capacities themselves and are willing to get involved, these countries. Manpower, their own hardware, and know-how how to work in the area. And I think there are plenty of opportunities. Of course, they are not financially capable to do that on their own. The neighboring countries need assistance from the EU and international organizations. But I think a very proper format for actually starting the process of reconstruction would be to adapt the 3 Cs initiative that we have ongoing in this area. And the 3 Cs initiative directly addresses the need for infrastructure that connects this eastern part of European Union, and Ukraine was awarded last year special status as a special partner. And I think this year in Bucharest, maybe Moldova will be granted the same thing. And a couple of very basic infrastructural projects can be done in the region, such as a highway connecting Poland and Romania through western Ukraine, and a couple of railways that connect Poland to Ukraine and Odessa to the port of Galați, which should be made in the European gauge. So we modernize the infrastructure, ensure commercial mobility, but also at the same time military mobility on our eastern flank.
Well, you have already mentioned some of the very particular projects that we should look at when we think opportunities. Besides infrastructure and the projects that you mentioned, what other areas should we regard as priority for us? And I'm here referring, because you mentioned 3 Cs initiative and the help that we also need to get from the EU and from our allies. Would you be able to say, like, here's where we need to focus in the next year, and here's where we need to focus in the next 5 years? So like a perspective on priorities, because obviously there's a lot to build.
Indeed, and I think we really have to take a very close look at how we have done the damage assessment. We have a couple of assessments, and all of them look like in the range of 150 billion euros. Well, but the numbers don't say actually anything when you just look at them as numbers. For example, energy. damages in the energy sectors only make up 6% of the total amount of damages. But those 6% of damages actually compound the effect, because having problems in the energy sector affects the entire civilian resilience, the morale of the population, military mobility, and everything is connected to energy. Infrastructure as well, because roads and highways and railways are only about 10 to 12% in some assessments. But if we would focus on these two and agriculture, which is Ukraine's main income source at the moment, and it was for a very long time, and we have to concentrate in the, I would say, this would be the triple mix that we have to have: energy, infrastructure, and agriculture. And in agriculture, I don't mean only hardware for planting crops and taking them, but the loading facilities that have been affected in various Ukrainian ports. Because you have the grains, but it's very difficult to take them out of the country and send them to the international markets if you don't have the loading facilities. And I think we should restore part of the Black Sea capacities in this regard.
Is it possible through current build-up techniques to restore this in the next year, or should we look forward to a new agreement? What is the balancing act there with regards to rebuilding and to reconstructing Ukraine capabilities?
Well, I was skeptical at the beginning that the grain agreement would hold more than the first time, but I think it will be prolonged, and I think we can do it. Actually, the infrastructure for ports and grain loading, it's not that complicated to be built in, say, 6 months or 1 year, and I think for the next crop it should be in place, and it can be in place. It just needs sufficient resolve and sufficient funds to be done.
Understood. Well, I know that you've just gotten the study, and obviously you need time to read, but considering the topic and considering the fact that we all have information in the news about Ukraine, about what's going on in Ukraine, and about the plans for reconstructing Ukraine, and because we have some time left, I am going to take a few questions in a row. Like if you've got 2-3 questions, we will get the bucket and we will have Horia answer. He's up for the challenge, I guess.
So, one question about the money.
Good question. Where's the money coming from?
Hi. One question about the money. So where's the money coming from? And then obviously some of the money is frozen Russian assets. You have one point in your study about that. How do you manage to transform the frozen assets into liquid, obviously financial capabilities? Thank you.
Well, I think from the entire plethora of donors and people who want to contribute, one should be made mandatory payer for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and that's Russia. And the frozen money can be, well, there are some legal hurdles at the moment, but I think they can be overcome. And money shall not be, of course, transferred directly to Ukraine, but to an international agency that shall disperse payments on a piece-by-piece basis, on a project basis. And of course, you have the Lugano Conference or the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference, which a lot of countries pledged to give funds to Ukraine. I don't think it will be an issue. Actually, it's not such a big sum that it's needed for these 3 things to be, and you don't have to entirely reconstruct the energy sector at the moment. You have time to do it. And of course, you won't, my idea is not only to get loans, because loans would kill Ukrainian economy on the long term. You have to give it grants and real sponsorship. And for that, you have to unfroze the frozen Russian assets and transfer them.
Okay, well, that's quite a challenge that you ended up with, unfroze the frozen assets. That said, because we do have the study here, again, I invite you to take a copy and read it and have questions to my colleague here in the breaks around the coffee or something else that you can find on the first floor or around here. Thank you very much for coming again. And I believe that we have next the night hall sessions that Sergio is going to announce. No? Okay.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jacek from Defense24. I'm very glad to see so many of you here on the ending panel. Thank you very much for joining me from Olga, REZNIKOVA, National Institute for Strategic Studies, Iuliia, OSMOLOVSKA, Kyiv office of GLOBSEC, Ukraine director, and Mykhailo, SAMUS, director of new Geopolitics Research Network. So we are waiting for the last panelist. I have a very difficult task, but also a very comfortable task. The synergy of that two perspectives need to be translated to the better picture of you. First of all, difficult because we will talk about how can we define the victory of Ukraine objectives and strategic impact. We will talk about the victory during the war. And during very bloody war with so many casualties, so many question marks about military assistance. But I think it is a very easy task right now because we had a lot of great panels dedicated to the various aspects of security cooperation, future of reconstruction of Ukrainian cooperation with Ukraine in this long-term context. So I think we will achieve a synergy of these difficulties and very positive message coming from our panel. First of all, I would like to ask my honorable guest in this panel about your opinion, under what circumstance would the Russian Federation will be willing to concede their defeat? Because I think right now we need to talk about the Russian defeat, and I would like to hear your opinion about the circumstances. Of course, from military economy, political side, because it is a combination of various aspects, and I think the Kremlin is right now not thinking only about the military terms of their defeat, they are thinking about the future of their regime. First of all, I think this is an open space for you, so from your perspective. Yeah, I think it's working.
Okay. I think I would say that Russia will never be willing to concede defeat, at least with the existing authorities. They live in a different reality, created by them and for them. They spent a lot of money for the war. They have been preparing for the war during the many years. They created a new reality for their population, according to which Ukraine, and not only it, does not exist. Russia's defeat will mean collapse for their authorities. That is why they will never concede defeat. And in their reality, this will be called the victory on their terms, even if those terms have to be invented. They will share the illusion of Russian victory among their population. In reality, this wants to be a real end of war. So this, war in mind of some population, of some people, not a real war. But we are fighting in a real war condition. It's absolutely a different reality. It's not in the war in Instagram, because, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in this war, have been murdered in this war. And we realize the consequences of real war as nobody else maybe. And that's why I think that this is a difficult question. And one thing that I would like to mention, how should Russia concede defeat? In what way? What should they do to sign a new agreement? But the lessons from learned from previous experience is that Russians shouldn't be trusted. So no new agreement with Russia will guarantee the peace for Ukraine and security for Europe. There are no answer for such questions. How to get compensation from Russia for destroyed human lives and property in Ukraine. So it's not just fixing of the fact of the Russia defeat, but it's a question of how to make this decision. This important thing. Thank you.
Before I would give voice to Mykhailo, I would like to comment one thing. I'm very appreciate to hear your remark about this true vision of warfare, because generally I think we are dealing right now in the West mostly, also in Poland, with this fake vision of war. War based on short films published for internet, for social media, and I think we lost not our capabilities to think about the warfare, modern warfare with high intensity, but we lost our vocabulary to define and to talk about the war, true war, with true casualties, with a lot of loss inside the civilian population. So thank you for underlining that, because I'm struggling with this problem during my classes with students, and I see that students are generally based on TikTok vision of war. So thank you for this kind of a remark. So.
Yeah, I just want to add that trying to define the defeat of Russia, of course, first of all, we need to define Ukrainian victory. And in Ukraine, it's actually very simple to do it, because it's some consensus exists. And for Ukraine, victory means that they occupy all of Ukrainian territory, of course, including Crimea. Crimea doesn't have any special status if we're talking about the occupation. It's the same like Kyiv, Chernihiv, or Lviv in Ukrainian reality. So, of course, the occupation of Ukrainian territories. Second, it's, of course, the getting compensation from Russia for damages. And third one, it's punishment for war criminals. This is three basic, I would say, basic elements of Ukrainian victory. And of course, the occupation of Ukrainian territory is a first task for all of us. Because talking about the compensation and punishment, Everybody understands it's a long story, it's pretty complicated in current international reality with current international institution status like United Nations, who will actually issue responsibility on, let's say, getting compensation from Russia. Only a new coalition of friends of Ukraine, as we have, for example, Rammstein format for Ukrainian weapon, providing the same should be a new coalition to make real compensation, getting compensation from Russia. Maybe it will be defrosting frozen actives of Russian oligarchs or Russian state. Maybe it will be in other ways, but obviously it should be a very strong coalition, because we cannot rely on United Nations or OSCE or other existing international institution, unfortunately, because from different reasons. For example, Russia is a member of Security Council, and it means that Russia could block everything trying to done through the United Nations. Even in Ukraine, we actually analyzing and trying to put to reality the obvious fact that Russia is not a legal member of United Nations. Maybe you know that Russia didn't make any legal procedure to be a member of United Nations. All of country made, but not Russian. So if you try to find in United Nations now documents, any facts that Russian Federation, the country with name of Russian Federation, became a member of United Nations, you won't find it. They just get the place of USSR, and after this they appear there on the table on the Security Council. So this is another issue which we should actually solve maybe after the Ukrainian victory. But anyway, we should create a coalition country which will make it real. I'm not sure that it will be easy, but anyway, from Ukrainian people understanding that first of all we need to make a military the occupation of Ukrainian territory. This is a decisive and very important issue. And after this, trying to make a reality, make real other issues, what I'm talking about. Thank you.
So my short additional question to you, because you mentioned about two aspects I would like to hear more about this agenda of victory. Do you think that maybe it is very controversial, what I'd like to mention, this recapturing territories occupied by Russia is much more easier than to build a tribunal or to capture war criminals, because this military side is based on the morale and this strength of Ukrainian army and synergy with military assistance from the Western side. But when we talk about the war criminals, we generally need to think about full-scale defeat of Russian state, because I think it is it's easiest to achieve right now recapturing the territory.
Yeah, even more. You know, actually, I could forecast, because we have a lot of like, let's say, dreams that okay, Ukraine deoccupy territories, and after this we will see collapse of Russia. It's a lot of fears especially on the West, that okay, it will be a collapse of Russia, and how we will
about the fears we will talk in the next round.
But from my opinion, it won't be any collapse. It will be even stronger dictatorship with using all of new technologies, with artificial intelligence, all of control, which is actually China now trying to use. But I think the Chinese friends make a gift to Russians, I mean to Putin regime, to make it even stronger. And another issue, for example, can you imagine that we are to occupy all of territories, but Russia will have will still have capabilities to launch missiles to Kyiv, to other areas, do not allow start a reconstruction of Ukraine, to destroy infrastructure, even civilian infrastructure. Remember this winter. Can you imagine that Russia will continue, because of a weak sanctions regime, which is actually, we could talk again, if you're talking about the victory, what does it mean victory? Victory, it means together with the occupation and two issues, I called it strong sanctions regime, because without cutting all of this, huge money, I would say rivers, not streams, but rivers, to Russia, 100 billion per month, to 100 million per month. Actually, without this, we cannot find a way to get a real victory in this situation.
Thank you for your opinion. And the last perspective on the circumstances that Russian Federation will be conceded defeat.
Yes, if I may add to what's been discussed now with regard to Ukraine's vision of victory, I have to emphasize probably the most important stuff, that Ukrainian society is determined to win this war. So 97% of Ukrainians believe that Ukrainian armed forces will eventually win this war militarily. That means that society is ready to sustain all the costs that we have, and even if the Western assistance will be diminishing, so they're ready to sustain this for a long period of time. That means that the war will last till the victory of Ukraine, whatever it takes. How long will it take? And that means that if the Western society is ready to help us as soon as possible, as fast as possible, for us to actually be able to finish this war this year, this will help us. If not, the war will be long and will be costly, not just for Ukraine, but also for the Western partners. This is the most important message I need to deliver. And also dwelling on what Mykhailo said, it had been a very interesting social polls with regard to what might be the most disappointment after the war. And 68% of Ukrainians said that it's impunity for Russia. So most of our Ukrainians actually want this legal accountability for Russia. And they even ready to sustain corruption, probably malfunction of economic management of the country, but they're not ready to accept that Russia is going impune in this war. So these are probably two main messages that I would like to deliver. Thank you.
So I will use my role as a moderator and I will ask two additional questions to your statement. So first of all, do you think that this winter and this defeat of the saturation attacks against Ukrainian cities are the game changer for morale inside society? Because the morale inside army is high because of their operations, their victories. But there was a lot of rumors, there was a lot of question marks, mostly in Western societies, that the winter might be the turning point when the morale inside the society would be defeated by the saturation missile attacks and use the flying bombs. Do you think that right now Ukraine can provide evidence to the Western societies, to Poles, to Romanians, to United Kingdom, that we are surviving, not only our armed forces, our society is surviving, and Russia cannot defeat us?
Yes, definitely the whole phenomenon about this war is about total defeat, if you wish. So it's about the society uniting around this and willing the victory for Ukraine at all costs. So then I also probably need to bring in the issue for negotiations, because it's quite high on the agenda these days. And I would say that for Ukrainian society, it would be very, very difficult to sell this issue of negotiating with Russia. And even if our Western partners would like to press President Zelensky with this, it would be very difficult for him to sell this issue to the Ukrainian society. So basically, the outcome might be internal political turmoil in Ukraine, fragile political situation, which would play in hands of Russia. So definitely this is not the way, this is not the route to follow, at least at this stage. And a lot of us are gambling about the outcomes of the expected counteroffensive. So we need to stress that this is not going to be just one successive blow to Russian armed forces. This is going to be a couple of successive counter-attacks that Ukrainian armed forces will be doing. And this definitely very much depends, actually very much the society, Ukrainian society is very much looking into it, and then the expectations of the war might be changing or not, but right now it's very early to say where the Ukrainian society is ready to go. But at least negotiations are not possible at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will avoid my second question. Maybe I will add that to the next round. But a very interesting remark about the counteroffensive. I can give you example from Polish media sphere and also Polish debate. I think we are dealing with two counteroffensive. One from the military side, when there is a lot of very deep debates about methods, about the future of this counteroffensive actions, and other, which is the mythical counteroffensive, which is commonly connected with this one big victory and one defeat of Russia, and end the war, because this is the problem for Europe. So I think we need to solve the problem with this narrative about the counteroffensive, and I very appreciate that you're underlining that, that there are two different points of view, and generally we are struggling with mostly this media form of defining the counteroffensive, because I think in this great room of experts in security and defense, we know that counteroffensive is the marathon, is the long-term vision, how to defeat larger army and a very strong defense forces which are occupying Ukraine and building their fortifications. So we have had something about the fears from the West. So I would like right now to ask you about this sphere of some scary vision of mostly West European sides about the future of Russia after defeat. We have had even today some opinions that there are some capitals where decision makers are afraid about the collapse of Russia, collapse of this whole international system because of defeat, military defeat of Russian occupation forces in Ukraine. So what is your opinion about this broader impact of Russian defeat militarily, and also when we talk about the political agenda for this European international relations system?
Actually, it's an interesting question. To my mind, the international system has been collapsed already. I can't say that this system is effective to prevent war, to stop the war at an early age, and a presidency of Russia in the UN Security Council. It's something unbelievable in these conditions. It looks like a joke, a bad joke. And the war in Ukraine proved the incapacity of the global system. Radical transformation of the global security institutions, first of all, the United Nations Security Council, the Red Cross, the OSCE is needed. Let's play imagination. When Russia loses its power, maybe it will become more dependent on China, to my mind. In this case, the impact on the region where Russia used to have a traditional presence should be assessed through the lens of China interests. We should take it in our mind for the future. Other important things is that European countries have overcome dependence on the supply of Russian energy resources, and it reduced several Russian threats for Europe. This policy should continue. This will enhance the EU resilience and shift the balance of power in the EU favor. So this is tricky questions with huge consequences for the global security and the whole democratic society, to my mind.
So do you think that perhaps from the military side we cannot go back to army as usual, because we have had a lot of discussion how to build our forces to the next war, how to, for instance, take some lessons learned from Ukrainian side to create our own response for high-intensive warfare, but simultaneously, we still think, I'm talking of course about the generalization of the West side, that we can still go back to the business as usual with Russia. So military experts, military staff are thinking that this system collapsed, but still I think the problem is lying inside the decision maker and diplomats in this civilian sphere of way of thinking about the international relation in Europe.
You know, continue business as usual with Russia is a way to a new aggression in Europe. It's a way to insecurity. So we should think about how to change Russia, not how to continue the business as usual with Russia. It's absolutely impossible through the lens of security, for global security, for regional security. And I think we should discuss or change focus from this side. And it's very important to continue discussion about this and to show why people should change their mind, because the world is changing. And we can continue to live like in before this war. Yeah, we have experience with the hybrid war in Ukraine, and the big reaction of the United Nations and other international organizations to the war in Georgia, for example, in occupation of Crimea by Russia. It enhance aggressor to continue to expand their imperial ambition, to continue aggression in other wider forms. So it's dangerous to continue think like nobody happened in the world.
Thank you very much. So for my next guest, how to fight with this fear sphere of Russian business as usual and coming back to the balance of power and only think about the war as an incident in international relations?
Yeah, the thing is even worse than just fears. It's interest. It's a business interest. It's a huge money. Can you imagine then, a couple years ago, even after Georgia, even after Crimea, still European Union had absolutely 100 billion euro business with Russia on energy sector and nuclear sector. Can you imagine these people? I mean, that made a profit with Russians. They need to destroy their businesses with the build for dozens of years. So of course for them this reality is absolutely against their interests. And Ukrainians saying these people that it's impossible to be in the same situation like before 24th of February. It's impossible. Ukrainians won't allow to be the same situation. And to be honest, I am very surprised that European Union find a way to be very strong to cut gas supply and make embargo on oil. To be honest, I didn't expect it. But it's absolutely great job. What is, for example, so we still have a problem with nuclear energy because Rosatom who is literally occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear station, still make a business with Europeans, with United States for dozens of billions dollars and euro now. And this is a reality because, you know, the profit is like a higher value than democracy, the human rights, or stuff like this for some people. So this is a problem, but I'm sure that we won't allow the oligarchs, even in Western Europe, United States, to continue business as usual because it's too much. It's too much after Irpin and Bucha and all of this awful stuff that somebody will make a business with Russians as before. Even Indians and even other countries in Latin America or something like this. So I think that if you're talking about the fears, I would say that we should prepare for long period of strong dictatorship in Russia. It means we should be prepared for a long war. And that's why we're talking about the NATO membership for Ukraine, because NATO will be a new reality. It won't be business as usual because, of course, a lot of people inside of NATO, especially oligarchs, they're dreaming about the changing the back to the great times when getting cheap gas, paying Russians, and absolutely great situation. But now it will be a different stuff. Can you see the Prigozhin and guys like this? Maybe they will rule the Russia. So of course Prigozhin is just a picture. Behind him a lot of oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, KGB guys, a lot of very dangerous guys, which is ready to get a power in post-Putin Russia. And it will be strong dictatorship with still huge resources, together with China, together with other countries which is supplying and buying something and paying money to Russia. It will be a very big problem for all of us in Western civilization to stay and to continue to develop. So that's why we're talking about a membership of Ukraine. Of course, after victory, which we're trying to define it. At least the occupying of territory, but unfortunately, even with the occupying territory, and can you imagine that Russia will continue to make missile launches against Ukrainian territory? So what NATO members will say? It's not a time yet, because it will be responsibility of Article 5. But unfortunately, we should make a very difficult decision to make Ukraine a member of NATO. Even NATO members will issue responsibility on Article 5, because otherwise it will be Russia will use the division between Ukraine and NATO and will attack NATO countries and divide NATO itself. This is one of the scenario, but I'm afraid it's pretty real. Thank you.
So one short additional question. You mentioned about the NATO, you mentioned about the decision makers in the West. Do you think that right now Russia is making or even preparing a larger counteroffensive, but in info sphere, when we see various groups of pro-Russian activists around Europe, and of course the first phase of war being won by Ukraine, without any doubts. In infosphere, we saw a lot of people support a great emotion to support Ukraine, to support Ukrainian armed forces, to criticize this Bacha regime in Kremlin. But right now, when we talk about the business as usual, when we talk about the emotions, we generally think that we will save the same emotion as we had. But I think in very large number of cases, we see different forms that emotions are created by Russian propaganda or make more pro-Russian propaganda because of emotions of some societies. So do you think that this hearts and minds battle might be much more problematic for NATO accession, for changing this attitude of pro-Russian decision makers in Western states than, for instance, I don't know, structural decision?
You know, unfortunately, we opposing the KGB criminal regime. And KGB is absolutely masters in the propaganda. So in Russia inside, they already created parallel reality and unfortunately very successful, let's say, operation to change Russian minds. And even we're talking about the possible democratization of Russia, I cannot imagine that Russians will support Navalny, for example. Can you imagine it? For me, it's impossible because majority of Russians, unfortunately, now under control of this huge propaganda, Russian propaganda pressure. And sometimes, you know, we are laughing on this propaganda. It's very simple, very primitive, but it works. It's a KGB methods, and unfortunately, it works. And about Europe, yeah, we see the activization of these attempts to, for example, to create some pacifist movement, kind of against war, for, of course, for peace, for everything good.
Against armaments?
Against armaments, against killing people, but in the same time we understand that this is very, very similar to what Soviet Union made in Western Europe during the Cold War. Pacifism against the nuclear weapon in Western Europe, against United States, trying to divide countries in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. This absolutely the same methods. I'm sure that KGB officers, they still, of course, the Putin KGB officer, and all of these guys are KGB officers, and oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, majority of them are KGB officers. So they
sometimes GRU.
Yeah, some of them are GRU, but majority is a KGB because of friends of Putin. But in reality, it's very difficult for Western Europeans to understand where is the reality, there is propaganda, where is the KGB methods. For us, for example, like a post-Soviet people, it's very easy to understand, to recognize it. But unfortunately, for our friends in Western Europe, sometimes it's very difficult. And Russia use it, of course.
I see that from those younger generations coming to my classes, and I'm always underlining, you need to refresh Mitrokhin archives with Christopher Andrews. I think it's a great form of shield against this Russian formula toward Western societies. And the last answer for my question, do you think that right now we are struggling with the hypothesis that the Russian defeat will overthrow stabilization of Europe, stabilization of international system? Because generally I disagree with this emotion, which is, of course, very attractive for Westerners, but I agree that the system collapsed, and from military side and also from political side. Do you agree with that, or what is your opinion?
Yeah, new time requires new bold decisions, definitely. And speaking about the Western fears, I can prove this in my communications with our Western partners, that most of hesitation about supporting Ukraine to win the war militarily comes from this uncertainty about the future of Russia. So we suggest them to consider this in a way of scenario building, like making different scenarios, projections, probability scores, and then to understand how we can stimulate the best possible outcomes of it. This is how I see the main obstacle which prevents actually the Western assistance of helping Ukraine to win this war militarily. Second observation about the future of Russia, why don't you consider the history? For instance, there was a big concern about Soviet Union to collapse. Do you remember this infamous George Bush speech about chicken Kyiv in Kyiv, saying that Ukraine should be in the USSR, and otherwise it would be a disaster? It didn't. Then the recent example is the membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO. Also, all of us were feared about Russia retaliation And what happened? Nothing. So basically, a lot of Russian toolbox of negotiations is about brinkmanship. So they are very ready to bluff, to go on the edge, but they're not ready to do these decisive actions. And I would like our Western audience actually to remember this. So they're mostly gambling rather than doing. And this is why I think that we need to activate all of our efforts just to help Ukraine achieve this victory in this war this year. And it would be very beneficial for all of us.
So you think that this accession of Finland and very close accession of Sweden might be also a very important tool to talk and discuss with your Western partners that Ukraine needs to be in NATO and can be in NATO? So we made the first step, not maybe with Ukraine, but with some Nordic states, and people are not recognized that this is the same platform, that we are overthrowing the main stereotypes about NATO, accession, about the Russian threat. Do you think that this is the largest step for accession of Ukraine in NATO?
Yeah, with regard to this accession, it's very interesting to recall why the support for membership in NATO raised in Finland, for instance. It happened after Bucha, when they saw these pictures. So before that, there was like 20% of population support for that, and after they saw the images of Bucha, it raised up to 80. So it means that definitely these times require non-conventional decisions and some kind of courage, not only from Ukraine, but also from our Western partners. And this is something where we're still struggling with. So you are not, forgive me to saying this, but you are not ready to accept bold decisions. And this is the problem that we have right now. And this is why Russia is winning in long term. Because the unsolved issue with Ukraine will be indeterminate insecurity for Europe for many years to come.
Thank you very much. Any comment? Okay, so very short comment.
About counteroffensive. Yeah, and about the counteroffensive finishing in this year. But in military understanding, if we count in the possible scenarios, so it's possible, for example, can you imagine that we will deliberate southern part in Crimea, but at the same time we will still have some areas in Donbass which is very difficult to occupy because it's urban terrain and pretty, you know, it's very difficult. Look at the Russians, they trying to get Bakhmut for several months. So it's possible that till the end of the year, we'll deliberate Crimea, and or maybe actually we'll deliberate Crimea. It will be blockade of Sevastopol, some historical dreams, and some areas in Donbass. But I would say that nothing changed. We will continue to fight, and I think that it will be even bigger support, even stronger support from our Western allies if we have this situation, because it will be okay. We will finish it 2024. It's not a problem. Time is not a problem. Problem is that to be together in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will make a very unconventional move for me, of course, personally. So I will give you a chance to our audience to give the space for questions from you. This is a very unconventional approach from my side because I have a lot of questions to you and a lot of topics I would like to mention during our discussion, but I think this is the time for the question from our audience, great audience. So ladies and gentlemen, please be welcome to use this place and time for asking your questions or sharing your opinion due to our discussion. So I think 3 questions in one time, and then please introduce you and then ask a question to direct to one person or to group of persons.
Okay, Greg Melcher, Center for the Study of New Generation Warfare. And as you work through the course of your conversation, you made clear that new generation warfare is not just the kinetic war, it's the non-kinetic information war. And you could win, Mykhailo, on all three of your points and still lose the war. So I'd like to suggest, with your feedback, a fourth condition, is that we dismember, as a condition of the end of this war, the complete information warfare apparatus in Russia. It means the IRA, the GRU, all these activities are ended completely and just taken apart. Further, Sputnik is disconnected. No country on earth will have Sputnik or RT in there, including Russia. I think that we really have to take it to that level. Otherwise, even if you did everything else, it's just going to be persistent. They're just going to, they're undermining our societies left and right. And, as you know, social media is out of control. We do it somewhat ourselves, but you look at almost every case, they're behind it. So I guess that's my question is, do you agree that really you should have a fourth condition that addresses the information warfare situation with Russia?
Okay, we have a first question from our audience. Is there any other question here? So I see.
Good evening. My name is Antonia. I'm from Zagreb, Croatia. I have a question for Mr. SAMUS and for Mrs. OSMOLOVSKA. Both of you, are in a way have any fear that Ukraine will be forced to make kind of a ceasefire, to be forced to make some territorial concessions, in a way forced by the West to listen, we have to broker some deal with the Russians. In return, you have to give a part of your territory. And if you do not concede, we're going to cease supporting you with the weapons. What's your take on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Any other? So the last question in this round.
Christopher Dandecker from King's College London. It's a follow-on question. Based on a statement, looking back at history, all wars end with negotiation. It's very rare that wars end with unconditional surrender. Germany is obviously, in 1945, is a key point, key example. Japan 1945 is an example too, but even in Japan, unconditional surrender was not wholly unconditional because of the role of the emperor. You can see where I'm going with this, that on the one extreme there's unconditional surrender, and then there's a spectrum of negotiations. And it seems to me, given the whole debate has been about victory, I would prefer the term success. For me, the interesting question is what the panel thinks Ukraine's prospects are on that spectrum, from unconditional surrender to various kinds of negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have three different questions. First about this info domain and the aspect of this additional aspect to the victory agenda, so-called victory agenda or success agenda. The second about this pressure from outside to change this approach, strategic approach to Russian policy toward Ukraine, and the third is negotiations. And it's always ways everywhere how to create the negotiations with such a cruel enemy. So, would like to start?
Yeah, I could start that. I will start with the third question. When we're talking about Russia and Soviet Union, not obviously you should have negotiations, because when you have KGB guys ruling the conflict, for example, Afghanistan, it was kind of a victory of Soviet Union and withdrawing forces. But of course it was proclaimed that it was the goals of the special operation completed, that everything is great, Communist Party, the greatest strategist in the world. Tomorrow Putin will say that this is a victory after the withdrawing forces from Crimea, and believe me, Russian people will say, great, super, let's go to drink vodka there. And so if you're talking about the Soviet Union, Russian Empire, Russian Federation, so-called Russian Federation, we shouldn't talk about negotiations. Of course, it will be negotiations, and I told that if you're talking about the compensation for damages, of course it will be negotiations. if you're talking about the punishment of the war criminals, of course it will be negotiations with somebody who will issue responsibility on this, but it shouldn't be, I cannot imagine that Putin will cite something, never. He psychologically for him it's impossible to sign something or even start negotiations about defeat of Russia. Of course, and connected to Anton's question about the pressure on Ukraine, we already done it with Minsk agreement. We actually made this already. It was a pressure on Ukrainian leadership. Ukrainian leadership, President Poroshenko signed it. Even it was absolutely against Ukrainian interests. You know, it was paper without any legal status in Ukraine inside of our legal system, and it was a paper without any word about Russia. You don't find any word about Russia in Minsk agreement. This is a very great example how we shouldn't act. And I think that, and you know what happened when President Poroshenko tried to make some legality of this document and bring it to parliament. It was a huge protest. 4 National Guard soldiers were killed, and after this Poroshenko stopped to make attempts to make it legal. So after this, Ukraine didn't make any steps on this, and I think that it's impossible, especially now, for example, for President Zelensky, even try to make some, I don't know, attempts to start negotiations or bargaining territories. It will be disaster, first of all, for President Zelensky and for Ukrainian state. By the way, Russia, of course, trying to use this hybrid technology to make this possible, that somebody from Ukrainian authority agreed to start these negotiations or even talking about it, and use, of course, to make a protest in Ukraine and destroy Ukraine from inside if somebody from Ukrainian authorities start the negotiations. This could be, again, Russian techniques to destroy it, and we see a lot of attempts to start negotiations, even from Africa. You know, the last attempts, it was a group of African countries proposed to be moderator of the process. Of course, from the Pope, from different, Brazil. We have a lot of moderators, and for President Zelensky it's impossible. For Ukrainian people it's impossible. So this is the situation. Thank you very much. And first question was
about the info domain.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's impossible to stop Russian propaganda before Russia collapses. But if you're talking about that next 30 years, we will have let's say, a neighbor with a very strong dictatorship, with a lot of technology, new technology on this system, and of course it will be strong propaganda from this, let's say, new Russia after the defeat. So we cannot stop it, unfortunately. So we need to be more resilient, not to, because it's impossible to stop dictatorship before collapse of this territory, but I am afraid that next 30 years it's impossible.
So. Okay, let me tell a bit about the negotiations with Russia. And the first point is that you shouldn't be misled by Russian intentions, actually, to negotiate. We define the moment for negotiations as a ripeness of negotiations, when both sides are unhappy with the status quo, they would like to change it, and they understand that unilaterally, by their own actions, they can't do it. So therefore, they invest in this joint problem solving. Right now, with Ukraine and Russia, it is not the case. So Russia still have these ultimate goals, like denazify Ukraine, demilitarize Ukraine, preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, and even getting rid of the current leadership of Ukraine. So they haven't changed these goals since the beginning of the war. And Ukrainians, for obvious reasons and for objective considerations, truly believe that we can win this war militarily. So that means that both sides not ready to negotiate at all. Second point about Russians' approach to negotiations is in psychological and mindset area. So Russians are not considering negotiations, unlike the Western partners, as a win-win and joint problem solving. So definitely they consider negotiations as another form of fighting, of competition. Therefore, they treat their partners, we call it partners, but they treat them as a foes. So, and therefore they apply all these techniques just to beat the opponent. And for these reasons, the Western partners obviously are misleading by thinking that they could achieve a win-win joint problem solving with Russians. This is the main problem that we have when we consider negotiations with Russia. So definitely Mykhailo is very right by saying that we will negotiate with Russia. The terms of reparations, the terms of how to secure that Russia is demilitarized and so on, but this will happen only after Ukraine will win this war. So the Ukrainian society, let me reiterate once again, is not ready to accept any other option. And we are ready to sustain all the costs that encounter that. So with regard to Crimea, it's very interesting with regard to negotiations, because let me remind you the case that was a year ago, and the Ukrainian side entered negotiations, and they were ready to consider Crimea being in breaks, sort of like a negotiation puzzle for another 15 years, and society didn't accept it. For these reasons, the official delegation had to change their expectations and their claims for negotiations. And even recently, one of the deputy head of presidential office said that Ukraine would be ready to consider a diplomatic solution for Crimea once we approach its administrative borders. This created big resentment in the society, and therefore the officials had to change their positions. So it means that it would be very difficult to sell to Ukraine any kind of negotiations with Russia, any kind of ceasefire, and so on. So definitely this is not the option for Ukrainians. And as I said in the beginning, that once the Western partners would press Zelensky to go this way, it would create internal turmoil. It would create internal fragility in the society. This would play in Russia's hands, and they will be happy to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And 5 minutes is for the last opinion and last answer for these 3 questions.
I think I add a little to my colleagues, because I totally agree with them. I would like to say about fear of Russia and fear of war in the Western society. It's interesting that this fear affects people who live in a country which is not in war. Ukrainians are not afraid of war, but the other people are afraid. It's something, it's interesting phenomenon. My message is, don't be afraid, because we see our example, how people can be strong in the war conditions. And this war is a war of attrition. And the question is, who will be exhausted first? Wounded Ukraine? I would say no. We are strong enough, we are resilient enough, it's proved. Russia, which still has strong manpower and resources, because there are no embargo to Russia. And you know a lot of examples where countries are living under severe sanctions and still developed a weapon of mass destruction. So let's think about the effectiveness of these sanctions. And who will be exhausted first? Maybe a Western country. Sometime I think, yes, maybe a Western country will be exhausted first, and then we will be facing the pushing to make an unfair agreement for Ukraine. And let's remember that after this unfair agreement, the world will be different, because a new world will be based on unbreaking rule, on unfair rule. So, do you like this new reality? Let's think about it.
Thank you for this great conclusion. I see that we are run out of time. I think, and a very short comment from my side. I think shaping and strengthening our military forces is much more easier to strengthen our mental approach to this threat coming from Russia. So I think this is the task for us for the next year, for the next months. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for this night session. Thank you very much for these great opinions and conclusions, and also your answer for these questions coming from our audience. Thank you for being invited by New Strategy Center. It's a great pleasure to be here. So ladies and gentlemen, I think this is the last panel for this day. So thank you very much for joining us again.